Welcome to day zero of psychiatric pathophysiology. So, the behavioral physiology of the central nervous system. Basically, we need to know the functions of each one of the brain lobes, functions of the neurotransmitters. It's very important to know all the dopamine uh, pathways, mesocortical, mesolimbic, nigrostriatal, and neuroendocrine. Those are rewards pathway. Also, a little bit what is the opposite effect of a dopamine and a serotonin in the clinical presentation of each one of the psychiatric disorders. For this lesson, the resources that you will have, and I would like you to look for it, is a 4-minute lecture for the neurotransmitter, the panopto, and osmosis videos. Of course, everything starts with anatomy. You know that the brain has a cortex, has a white matter and a gray matter. Also, each one of the parts of the brain um, and of the lobes are very interesting because each one has different functions. So we have the frontal lobe located uh, before the central sulcus and the parietal lobe on the back, and the most posterior lobe is the occipital lobe, and very close to the brainstem over it is the temporal lobe. We have also the cerebellum. We have what we call the primitive brain called the encephalon here on the other picture, and over the diencephalon you have what we call the limbic system. So the limbic system is going to have um, several structures. One of the most important is the cingulate gyrus. Under the cingulate gyrus is the corpus callosum. I don't know if I can point this. So this is cingulate gyrus, and this is the corpus callosum. This is the diencephalon, and this is the brainstem. And we have the cerebellum. The frontal lobe usually is used to make decisions. It has to do with our behavior and some kind of memory, and also uh, it has to do with language. I'm going to go over this in a few minutes. So, abstract and concrete reasoning, having the motivation uh, and aspects of emotional response, and also the organization of the language has to do with the frontal lobe functions. So, frontal lobe has uh, a primary motor cortex and also a premotor cortex. There's also another section called prefrontal cortex. Those three regions are very specific in their functions. In the frontal lobe is also located the Broca area. Broca area is the one that permits that we can express ourselves in a fluent way when we have a disorder problem due to ischemia or embolia. Patients are going to present non-fluent expressive aphasia. Um, when there's problems in the anterior cingulate gyrus, the orbitofrontal or the lateral prefrontal cortex. Problems are going to be presented in the higher functioning of the brain, specifically for abstract reasoning, motivation, planning, social behavior, difficulty in making decisions, and also in the production of the language. So, those are all executive functions. Frontal lobes are also related with social interactions and decision making. The prefrontal cortex has two different regions. One is the ventral medial prefrontal cortex that almost every mammals have, but the second one, it's the lateral one, prefrontal cortex, it's only present in primates. Parietal lobe, located just behind the central sulcus, it's going to be um, integrating the sensory and the spatial relations. Remember that we have the sensory area located there. So it also uh, has like the neurons that comes to have from the thalamus in order to have body awareness where our limbs are located. It filtrates the stimulus, and also it has a part of memory and nonverbal memory. It makes the formation of concepts. The functions of the temporal lobe has to do with visual spatial recognition. Also, temporal lobe is related with emotional modulation and interpretation because in the temporal lobe, inside it is in relation with the limbic system. Temporal lobe has to do with auditory perception, and also in the temporal lobe is located the Wernicke area, that is the one that makes us comprehend our speech or our language. It has also aspects of sexual action, uh, interpretation and meaning of social contact, attention, and motivation. Oh, sorry. Temporal lobe also has to do with memory. So, if we want to summarize the temporal lobe functions, um, we can say that it has to do with speech perception, speech production, hearing, episodic memory. We're going to talk about that in a little bit. What is episodic memory? Phonological, um, semantic, social, visual. In each part of the temporal lobe, very complex, has their specific function. We're not going to ask about this. But it is important to know that the temporal lobe is divided in an anterior area and a posterior area. So the ventral structures are going to be processing visual information, and the dorsolateral parts, the non visual information, I mean, the abstract concepts. The same way, the temporal lobe, posterior structures are going to be contributing for basic object representation, and the anterior are going to contribute with more complex conceptual association. The occipital lobe, we know that there is where we process our visual perceptions, and but it also has to do with storing of memorization, recognizing face and places. So, okay. And the frontal lobe, voluntary movement, because there is the area prefrontal motor cortex and also abstracting reasoning, intellectual functions. The amygdala is located here, just in front of the hippocampus. We have two amygdalas, and as you have heard, is part of the temporal lobe. It has to do with our emotions, perceptions of fear, and also with memory. Has been implicated in disorders as depression, anger, or problems of insomnia. The functions have to do with behavioral outputs. So that means that there we process our rewarding, but also our fearness. Um, Also, the amygdala has been suggested to be part of the incentive learning, a process in which the stimulus are attributed affective significance, and thereby it motivates our behavior, responses, and action. So, as you see here, we have the amygdala, the hippocampus, right? And the olfactory bulbs, the locus coeruleus, the rapha nucleo. Those are part of the limbic system. Here is the amygdala again, in between the basal ganglia in color purple, we have the thalamus. So, basal ganglia is the one that has to do with the control of our anger. So, generally, we think that the prefrontal cortex is the main modulator of the amygdala response, but the signals have to pass from the um, through the basal ganglia before going to the prefrontal cortex. So it is the basal ganglia, the one that it is able to control our anger. So the limbic system is constituted by several structures: the limbic cortex with the cingulate gyrus and the parahippocampal gyrus. That's here. Okay. And then we have the hippocampus formation that has different structures, including the dentate gyrus. Then we have the amygdala and the hypothalamus. That's here very close to the hypophysis or pituitary gland. Limbic system, it's as you've seen, very complex, and each one of the structures that form the limbic system have specific actions. But in general, I would like you to remember that the limbic system has to do with memory, especially the amygdala, with learning, as well as goal directed and emotional behaviors. Hippocampus, for example, you have surely hear that problems in the hippocampus has to do with dementia. Problems in the amygdala has to do with impaired cognition and affective processing. Problems in the hypothalamus has to do with sleep disorders or neuroendocrine dysfunctions. Problems in the ventral stratum, located here, has to do with depression or impaired reward learning. The cingulate gyrus has to do with problems of impaired cognition, apathy, and depression or motor symptoms. So, the learning and memory, it's our thoughts are very complex process, and it has to do with several parts of our brain. So our cerebral cortex takes part there, our thalamus, our limbic system, and our reticular formation. Declarative memory, the example is, for example, this evening in my living room, I ate steak for dinner. It's and it can be divided in episodic memory, which is the ability to remember any specific occasion, right? Like this example, or semantic uh, memory that has to do with recall of general facts, right? So the hippocampus has to do to has their the function of the hippocampus has to do with the declarative memory that can be episodic or semantic. Hippocampus has three parts: ventral, intermediate, and dorsal. That can be divided in the dentate gyrus, CA1 and CA3. I'm not going to ask about that. I just want to make the point that it has like a trisynaptic loop, and that loop goes from the cortical to the ethnorenal cortex, and it has several paths. So it has a path between the dentate gyrus region, and that dental gyrus genus projects to the other two parts. That's why it's called a trisynaptic loop. So hippocampus has to do with memory, with learning, and that memory, it can be short term and long term, can be episodic, and can be semantic. Locus ceruleus, it's also part of the central nervous system, and it's located here in the brainstem, and has several projections. It has one in color purple, that's a ascending locus ceruleus projections. Um, sorry, number one, that goes to the endocrine, here to the endocrine, autonomic regulation. It has one that goes to the amygdala. This one. This one goes to the endocrine. This goes to the amygdala and influences detection of associative learning. The one that goes to the hippocampus has to do with learning and memory, to the hippocampus. The one that goes to the cortex, that's the purple one. It's the regulation of attention, arousal, and cognitive evaluation of pain. Has to do with neuroepinephrine, and it has a descending pathway, also in color gray, that goes to the brainstem and the spinal cord. This is a positron emission tomography scan that's um, comparing a normal brain with depression, bipolar, schizophrenic, and OCD brain scan. As you see, depression and bipolar brain have more colors, bluish colors, which means low activity, and more depressive or presence of neurotransmitters that has to do with depression, versus schizophrenic and OCD brain have more yellowish and red areas, which neurotransmitters are uh, has to do with those two expression of disorders. So we can compare the brain activity during periods of depression or during periods of other type of disorders